Looking at the period from the 3rd through the 7th century, I think it's useful for us to go through a little bit of political history to try to understand the remarkable changes that were taking place in the Eastern Mediterranean at the time. And there's three really big cities involved: Rome, Constantinople, and Mecca. So from the 3rd through the 5th century, Rome goes through a pretty significant period of decline. As you can see in this 19th century Russian painting by Karl Brulov that shows Rome being sacked, and it was actually sacked several times by the Vandals and others coming from Central Europe. Then they're taking away here. You can see the menorah and all kinds of things like this. Whereas the church seems kind of stable yeah, on the far right there. At any rate, it's a period when Rome is going to go through a series of significant steps downward in its authority, and this is going to affect the balance of power in the entire region, as we shall see. Israel will remain within the boundaries of the empire, but just barely, because as I'll show you on a map in just a second, the eastern border of the Roman Empire gets pushed steadily towards the west, and Israel just maintains, with the exception of about 15 years, that space on the easternmost part of the Roman Empire, which was once so huge, and it's just barely hanging on in there. The Christian population in Israel during this time, however, is growing significantly, both from conversion to Christianity from the indigenous populations, Jews and others, and also from immigration into the region for a whole host of reasons. Remember, Israel is a kind of a crossroads, and so as Rome was able to consolidate its control in the region, the presence of the legions, so on, development of infrastructure, there's attractiveness in that region for many settlers, and we see the population actually increases at this time, but the balance of the population will change, and the local Christian population in Israel will grow, which is not necessarily a good sign for the Jewish population. In the middle of the 4th century, there is a revolt that erupts in northern Israel, where Jews are very dissatisfied with the leadership of one Gallus. This is, however, put down quite decisively, and ultimately will just accelerate the pro-Christian orientation of the Roman Empire to the detriment of the local Jewish population. There is a moment of respite shortly thereafter when the Emperor Julian, known in some quarters as Julian the Apostate, tries to make some kind of connection with the Jews in Israel and in the diaspora by promising to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. This generates a lot of enthusiasm among Jews because you'll recall until this time the temple has been desecrated by Hadrian, who rebuilt a temple dedicated to Zeus there, and actually, or Jupiter actually, and also even forbade the visiting of Jerusalem by Jews except on the anniversary of the destruction of the temple. So Julian the Apostate's offer to rebuild the temple, although it's short-lived because he will be killed in battle, ultimately increases the enthusiasm of Jews and evokes even more ire of the local Christian population. The tensions are increasing, and one of the last things that the Patriarchate was able to do, you recall that the Jews do have some kind of self-governing rulership under the Patriarch, the Nisiut. The Patriarch Hillel II, also known as Hillel Nicaea, to distinguish him from the Hillel who lived before the Common Era, he designed a 19-year calendrical cycle, which would later be added upon in further centuries, but basically he sketched out the possibility of working with a calendar that is mathematically calculated rather than relying on the traditional sighting of the moon, which is something that was, in place for many hundreds of years. But there were a couple of moments in Jewish history when, for example, the Samaritans and now possibly the local Christians might have interfered with that process. And so Hillel Nicaea, by putting in place a fixed calendar, was able to really establish something very concrete and important for the survival of the Jews in the long term. He was very concerned that the Christian Empire, the Roman Empire, now officially Christian under Constantine, would actually disavow the power of the Sanhedrins. And in fact, this would come to pass, although not under Constantine, it would happen in the 5th century. So that's basically what's going on in Rome as it falls into decline and how it has an impact on the Jewish people, particularly in Israel. If we look at Constantinople, we see an acceleration of this negative trend. So first of all, where is Constantinople? If you have a look on this map here, you see it's the big red mark, and it's on a very important strait called the Bosporus that separates essentially the Mediterranean Sea from the Black Sea. Very important site for maritime trade. It was originally known as Byzantium, and the Emperor Constantine in the year 324 renames it Nova Roma, the New Rome, and it was also known as Constantinople, which is Greek for Constantine's city. And this essentially becomes the center of what's called later the Byzantine Empire. It's the Eastern Roman Empire, and as Rome goes into further decline and is sacked many times, Constantinople becomes even more important. It is, by the way, now known as Istanbul because when it was conquered in 1453 by the Turks, then it received this new name. So Byzantium becomes Constantinople, becomes Istanbul. And one last detail while we're at it, not relevant to our period, but since we already went to the 15th century, when Istanbul is no longer a Christian city, then Moscow takes upon itself the kind of mantle of Eastern Christianity, understanding itself as the third Rome, right? You have Rome, the first Rome, then you have the second Rome, or Nova Roma in Constantinople with the Byzantine Empire, and then finally Moscow is or at least self-understands as the third Rome, the inheritor of this entire Eastern Christian tradition. The implications for Jews of this shift from Rome to Constantinople are also generally negative. There's increasingly worse conditions for Jews as we move through the 5th century, as the Roman Empire, now ruled from Constantinople, is more and more pro-Christian. The Patriarchate is formally abolished at the beginning of the 5th century. The kinds of things that they were charged with is illustrative of the kind of hostility. The emperor charged that Jews were using the Patriarchate to build synagogues, right? The idea being that synagogues should fall into disrepair and then never rise again. We're going to talk a little bit more of that in the next lecture. That Jews were holding Christian slaves, or at least non-Jewish slaves, and were circumcising them, which is part of halakha. There's a whole discussion here of how slaves are to be treated in Judaism, and circumcising them, essentially making them partially Jewish. Upon manumission, they would be completely Jewish. That was something which was viewed with tremendous hostility. And finally, the rabbis in Israel under the Patriarchate were occasionally adjudicating legal cases that also involved Christians. And this was seen as an affront to Roman law and especially to Christian sensibilities. So this is a period of time when there are more and more legal restrictions placed upon Jews in Israel. The Patriarchate is declining and eventually is completely abolished in the 5th century. Definitely not a great time for the Jews. Now let's go quickly to the final city, Mecca. And I'm only just going to touch on it because really we're going to spend a lot more time talking about Islamic influence and rule in Israel, which will last much longer. But just to get the political history together, it's really not only Mecca, it's also Persia, because basically what happens is, if you have a look at this map here, this represents the diaspora, the Jewish diaspora in the Roman Empire, and you can see that there are 3 big chunks of Jewish settlement in the Roman Empire at this time. You've got some in Asia Minor, which would be here in Western Turkey. You've got a big chunk of Jews living just north of what would be Israel in places like Antioch and Damascus and Syria. And then you've got another big chunk in Egypt. This map doesn't show the settlement in Israel as well, but there would be a lot, of course, centered in northern Israel in particular. And then as you go across the Mediterranean basin, you see lots of dots. Those dots represent individual Jewish communities, and you've got them all the way up in the Rhineland in Germany, in France along the Rhone River and on the southern coast of France in the Mediterranean. You've got them throughout Hispania or Spain, and then you've got some in North Africa, like even Carthage and Kyrene that we saw earlier. Though those are all inside the Roman Empire. There is only one really large Jewish population outside of the Roman Empire, and that is just to the east, just above where my head is on this map. This is, of course, the Babylonian center, which will become very powerful, and ultimately Babylonia, under the Persians, will invade Israel in the year 614. And Israel will very briefly fall under Persian control once again, but only for a very brief period of time, because the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius would come back in, and by the year 629 he is back in Jerusalem again. This would also be short-lived, as we shall see shortly, but before we leave the Byzantine Empire, I just want to point out one other area where there was a Jewish settlement, at least up until the 6th century, and that is in the region of contemporary Yemen, in the so-called Kingdom of Himyar. This is so bizarre and fascinating. So here's the Arabian Peninsula, and you can see where the Kingdom of Himyar is in the southern part of it. There's a new book out by Professor Bowerstock called The Throne of Adulis, which tells the amazing story of this Jewish kingdom in the region, which lasted for quite some time. So here's the story. We know that Jews lived in this region for centuries before the period that we're discussing here. We know, for example, that Herod sent a brigade of Jews there in the year 25 before the Common Era, and it's highly likely that there were settlements of Jews that met them when they arrived. We know from other sources that there was a King Abkarib As'ad who, in the turn of the 5th century, was having conflict with local Christians and local Christian kingdoms, and this prompted him to convert to Judaism. This, by the way, is not an unusual kind of story. We see a very similar thing in the Khazar Empire, which I hope to discuss not too long from now, when the Khazarians, seeing that they were on the one hand pressed by the Christians and on the other hand pressed by the Muslims, they saw Judaism as a third way of maintaining their independence. And it appears that King Abkarib As'ad also saw that as an option for his Himyar people. So we don't have really great sources about that conversion, but apparently it happened sometime around the turn of the 5th century. We have other sources, Christian sources, that describe a King Yusuf Asar Yatar du Nuwas that lived about 100 years later, and presumably Himyar is basically a Jewish kingdom this entire time. And this King Yusuf is at war with neighboring Christian territories and persecuting local Christians. Again, this is a Christian source that is not sympathetic to King Yusuf, but there's no reason to specifically doubt that there was conflict going on. And what's fascinating is that, so far we only have kind of sketchy little bits of pieces of data to suggest that this kingdom was Jewish, but a lot of new material has been discovered in funeral inscriptions, for example, in Beit Shan in northern Israel and elsewhere, that specifically refers to these Himyarites as being Jewish, and that they want to be buried in Israel and all kinds of things like this. So it's actually quite likely that, in fact, there was this Jewish kingdom in southern Yemen at this time. We know they went to war with neighboring Ethiopia, and that King Yusuf was dethroned at this point from the kingdom of Aksum, which was in the region, and that signaled the end of the Himyarite Jewish kingdom. But we're talking about something that lasted for well over a century. Really fascinating, I think. I wish I had more time to study this stuff. Anyways, let's go back to the bigger picture. The big picture is, remember that the Sasanian Empire makes a quick penetration into Israel, displacing the Byzantine Empire in the year 614, but it only lasts a very brief time, because in 629, Heraclius reconquers the region, and then he lasts for about 15 odd years, and the Muslims conquer it in the year 646. The Muslims, of course, will be in control of the Middle East and North Africa for quite some time, and we'll have a large Jewish population living under Muslim rule, and so we're going to look at a lot of these communities in the following lectures. But before we get to Muslim rule, let's talk a little bit about the Diversus Judaeos tradition in the Byzantine Empire, which will take us a little deeper into, unfortunately, the negative circumstances that Jews experienced at this time. Thank you very much for watching.